back in 1979, when I first translated Ajahn Lee's Keeping the Breath in Mind. We went to the World Fellowship of Buddhists in Bangkok and asked for a list of different Dharma centers around the world to send the books to. And the Buddhist Society of Victoria was one of them. In fact, it was the only one in Australia that they gave. I never thought I'd be here. So here I am. So, Ajahn Fuang once said that if you're going to teach Dharma to people, you should first get them to meditate. So let's meditate first. Close your eyes and start with thoughts of goodwill. Goodwill is the wish for happiness. A happiness that comes from within, a true happiness that harms no one. And the good thing about that kind of happiness is that because it comes from within, it doesn't need to take anything away from anyone else. So there's really no conflict between your true happiness and that of anyone else, which is why we can develop this as an unlimited attitude. You also realize that happiness comes from actions. So when you wish for your own happiness, you're basically saying, may I understand the causes for true happiness and be willing and able to act on them. Goodwill for other people is similar. May they understand the causes for true happiness and be willing and able to act on them. And that's a thought you can have for anyone without hypocrisy. You're not turning a blind eye to the fact that many people have been behaving in pretty bad ways. And you're not saying, well, may you be happy doing whatever you're doing. If someone is misbehaving, you're saying, may you see the error of your ways and willingly change. You don't wish for a little revenge, you don't wish for a little punishment first. You're hoping that they would voluntarily see how their actions have been causing harm and how they can stop. So these are thoughts you can think without hypocrisy, without conflict. So start with goodwill for yourself. Tell yourself, may I be truly happy. And then extend the same thoughts to others. Start with people who are close to your heart, your family, your very close friends. May they find true happiness too. And then spread those thoughts out in ever-widening circles to people you know well and like. To people you like even though you don't know them so well. To people you're more neutral about. And to people you don't like. You're not being forced to like people. You just wish them well. And you realize the world would be a much better place if everybody could find true happiness within. Spread thoughts of goodwill to people you don't even know. And not just people, living beings of all kinds, east, west, north, south, above and below, out to infinity. May we all find true happiness in our hearts. And now bring your attention to the breath. Take a couple of good long, deep in and out breaths. And notice where you feel the breathing process in the body. Because when the Buddha talks about breath, that's what he's talking about. It's not so much the contact of the air at your nose. It's the flow of energy that allows the air to come in and go out. Where do you feel that flow? Where are you most sensitive to it? Focus there. And then ask yourself, does long breathing feel good? If it does, keep it up. If not, you can change. Make it shorter, more shallow, faster, slower, heavier, lighter. You can experiment for a while to see what rhythm and texture of breathing feels good for you right now. If your mind wanders off, just drop whatever it was that it followed. You'll be back at the breath. That happens 10 times, 100 times. Just keep coming back, 10 times, 100 times. Don't give up. Don't get discouraged. The fact that you catch the mind is a sign that you're alert. That's a quality you want to encourage. So when you do come back, reward yourself with a breath that feels especially good. That way you'll be more inclined to want to come back. If there are any pains in the body, don't focus on them yet. Focus first on the parts of the body that you can make comfortable by the way you breathe. As the breath gets comfortable, there is a tendency sometimes to focus on the comfort and forget about the breath, in which case you lose the foundation for your concentration. So to counteract that tendency, the next step is to be aware of the whole body as you breathe in, the whole body as you breathe out. And a good way to build up to that whole body awareness is first to go through the body section by section, to familiarize yourself with how the breath feels in different parts of the body. A good place to start is down around the navel. Locate that part of the body in your awareness. Watch it for a while as you breathe in and breathe out to see what rhythm of breathing feels good there. And if you feel any sense of tension or tightness in that part of the body, allow it to relax, so that no new tension builds up as you breathe in, and you don't hold on to any tension as you breathe out. Now move your attention up to the solar plexus, the area right in front of the stomach, and follow the same 3 steps there. 1, locate that part of the body in your awareness. 2, watch it for a while as you breathe in, breathe out to see what rhythm of breathing feels good there. And 3, if there's any sense of tension or tightness, allow it to relax. Now move your attention up to the middle of the chest and follow the same steps there. Now bring your attention to the base of the throat. Now bring your attention to the middle of the head. As you breathe in, think of the breath energy entering through the eyes, ears, nose, from the back of the head down from the top of the head, going deep into the brain. And as you breathe out, think of it radiating out from the head in all directions, gently working through any patterns of tension you may feel in the jaws, in the forehead, the eyes, the back of the neck, and dissolving those patterns of tension away. Now focus your attention to the back of the neck, right at the base of the skull. As you breathe in, think of the breath energy entering there from the back, and then going down through your shoulders, the arms, the hands, out to the tips of the fingers. And as you breathe out, think of it radiating out from all those parts of the body into the air. And as you get more sensitive to these parts of the body, if you notice that you're holding more tension in one side than the other, allow that side to relax, to bring things into balance, and see if you can keep it relaxed all the way through the in-breath, all the way through the out. Now keeping your attention focused at the back of the neck, this time as you breathe in, think of the breath energy entering there, and then going down both sides of the spine, down to the tailbone. And as you breathe out, think of it radiating out from the entire back into the air. And here again, if you find that you're holding more tension in one side of the back than the other, allow that side to relax, to straighten out your spine and to bring things into balance. And then see if you can keep it relaxed all the way through the in-breath, all the way through the out. Now bring your attention down to the tailbone. As you breathe in, think of the breath energy entering there, and then going down through the hips, the legs, past the ankles, the feet, out to the tips of the toes. And as you breathe out, think of it radiating out from all those parts of the body into the air. And here again, if you're holding more tension in one leg than the other, allow that side to relax. And see if you can keep it relaxed as you breathe in, as you breathe out. Now that completes one cycle on the survey of the body. If you're meditating on your own, you can go through the body again any number of times at your own pace. But for right now, choose any one spot in the body where it seems most congenial to focus your attention. Allow your attention to settle there, and then from that spot to spread out to fill the whole body. So you're aware of the whole body breathing in, the whole body breathing out. There may be a tendency for the range of your awareness to shrink, especially on the out-breath. So remind yourself each time you breathe in, whole body. Each time you breathe out, whole body. Allow the breath to find whatever rhythm feels good. All you have to do right now is try to maintain the sense of centered but broad awareness. Like the light of a candle in an otherwise dark room. The flame of the candle is in one spot, but its light fills the room. This centered but broad awareness is healing for the body, healing for the mind. And because it's all around and still, it provides a good foundation for insight to arise. But for the time being, don't worry about the insights. Just try to make this foundation strong. Okay, now you're welcome to continue meditating as I give the talk. There's a tendency in the modern world to reduce the Dharma to sound bites. It's all about compassion, it's all about change, it's all about letting go. And the problem with the sound bite, of course, is that you get only one bite out of what is actually a nourishing meal. So tonight I'd like to talk about one of those sound bites and see how it's better to see the whole context of what the Buddha taught on the topic. And that's the issue of acceptance. We're often told that the Buddha says to accept everything, and it's all about acceptance. But there are very few things in the canon where the Buddha says you should accept something. In fact, the word acceptance is used most often in accepting invitations. But there are things that he says that very few things that he says to accept, and a lot of things he says not to accept. The things he says to accept are basically four. One, you accept the fact that in this human realm there's going to be harsh speech, negative speech, and you're going to be subject to it. Two, you accept the fact that there will be pain. You have to learn how to deal with it. Three, you accept the fact when someone has died that they are dead. You don't pretend that you don't keep hoping that something will happen, they'll bring them back. And the fourth is when you realize you've done something wrong, you accept the fact that you did something wrong. You don't try to deny it, you don't try to say there was no harm done after all. But the Buddha doesn't leave you just with accepting these things. He says there's ways to live with them and not suffer from them. For example, with harsh speech. He says to remind yourself, one, it's the nature of human speech. So when people criticize you, sometimes it will be well-meaning, sometimes it will be ill-meaning. Sometimes it'll be true, sometimes it'll be false. Sometimes it'll be useful, sometimes it'll be useless. So when someone is saying something that is false, useless, and ill-meaning to you, it's not out of the ordinary. My teacher had a student one time who felt that she was a victim of gossip quite a lot. And she was meditating one day in the same room with Ajahn Fuang. And she had this vision of herself in a hall of mirrors, extending back in this direction, extending back in that direction. And the thought came to her that I've probably been the victim of gossip, not just in this lifetime, but in many lifetimes. And the thought got her even more depressed. So after a meditation session, she went to see him, hoping to get some comfort. And she told him about the vision. He said, well, you were the one who would be born in this world anyhow. If you didn't want this kind of thing to be said about you, you have to go someplace else. So you have to accept the fact that this is the way the human realm is. So it's not out of the ordinary. And we realize, okay, I'm not the only one being subjected to this kind of stuff. It's happening all over the world. That makes it easier to take. That's one way to think about it. Another way, this is Venerable Sariputta, says when someone says something negative and harsh to you, just tell yourself, an unpleasant sound has made contact at the ear. And leave it there. Now, how many times have you thought that? It's usually you pull it in and say, okay, why are they saying this thing about me that's really outrageous, it's really unkind, it's really disrespectful, whatever. Okay, you've basically taken one little note and you've made a gong out of it. It's reverberating through your mind. And whose fault is it? They've stopped saying that. But your mind is the one that's now saying all these things. You're the one who's actually making things worse. So remind yourself, okay, when they've stopped saying that, that's the end of that sound. Makes it a lot easier to let go. And to realize, okay, it's not that unbearable. So there are ways of thinking about these things so that you don't have to suffer from them. Similarly with pain. The Buddha talks about how there will be pain in the body, but at the same time there are pains in the body, there are also pleasant sensations in the body. You can focus on those. And that gives the mind a good foundation to stay with so that when it actually wants to look into the pain, it's coming from a position of strength. This is one of the reasons why we work with the breath energy as we meditate, to create a sense of well-being. So you're not feeling that you're totally surrounded by pain or totally eaten up by pain. From there, he recommends that you look at the fact that it's a combination of the pain and the perception around the pain that's having an effect on the mind. So you try to change the perceptions. Now in the forest tradition, Ajahn Lee is the one who has the most to say about how to maintain a sense of pleasure even in the midst of pain. Ajahn Mahabua talks about how you question your perceptions around the pain. Because a lot of us, all of us, encountered pain first before we even knew human language. We had to deal with it in our own sort of instinctive way. And we came up with different ways of visualizing the pain to ourselves, ways of understanding the pain, which if we were brought to our conscious awareness right now, we'd say, well, that's stupid. But we don't tend to be conscious of how we perceive the pain, our relationship to the pain. So it's good to ask questions and dig it out. A good question might be, is the pain the same thing as the body? Say you have a pain in your knee, is the pain the same thing as the knee? And part of your mind will say, of course not. But then you actually look how you visualize the pain to yourself, how you perceive it, and you realize you actually treat it as if it were part of the same thing. So try to analyze it. The physical pain and the physical part of the body is made up of the four elements of earth, water, wind, fire. Those are not chemical elements, they're more like elementary sensations. None of those is the same as pain. The pain is something separate. When you can make that analysis, you begin to see that the pain moves around more than you thought. You can also ask it, does the pain have a shape? Does it have an intention toward me? Does it want to hurt me? Well, no. Does part of your mind suffer because of that feeling that the pain is out there to persecute you? Sometimes yes. And so you can say, I don't have to believe in that perception. That's one way in which I am making myself suffer. Because the mind has a tendency, especially when there's pain, that it's trying to send a message to the next moment. Watch out, watch out, watch out, there's this pain right here. And that message that we keep sending to ourselves makes the pain worse. So try to catch the mind doing that kind of thing. You find that you can deal much more effectively, live with the pain and not suffer quite so much. One perception I found useful is when you see that the pain has its sharpest point, but it doesn't stay the same. It moves around quite a lot. And it comes and goes, comes and goes, comes and goes. When it's coming, you can ask yourself, is it coming at you or is it going away? Most of us feel like we're sitting in the front of a seat of a car and everything's coming at us all the time. The pain is there attacking us, and we kind of gather it up. But Ajahn Lee's image is of a water buffalo plowing a field, and you tie a bag to the water buffalo's legs so that as the dirt falls off the plow, you put it in the bag. We just keep gathering up all this pain that's happened to us over however long it's been there. And of course it's going to weigh us down. So you don't gather it up. What's past is past, and just let it go. And if you can perceive it as going away from you, it's a lot easier to bear. It's like sitting in the back seat of a car, one of those old station wagons with the seats face back. Do you have those in Australia? Okay, and as soon as something comes in the range of your awareness, it's already going away from you. I discovered this perception one time when I was in Singapore. John King here took me to see a Chinese doctor to treat my back. And the doctor had me lie face down on the floor. And he started rubbing oil on my back. And at first I started feeling good. But then he started rubbing harder and harder and harder, and the back was getting kind of raw. And then he pulled out these bamboo whisks. He started beating me on my back. And my first thought was, my gosh, what kind of bad karma do I have? I have to sit. But then I realized, okay, if I saw that each strike of the bamboo, as soon as the pain started, it was going away, I could stand it. So the pain did sting, but I wasn't suffering from it. That's a good perception to hold in mind, because this is our main problem around pain, is the perceptions we have, the stories we tell ourselves about the pain. This is what the Buddha calls verbal fabrication and mental fabrication. Verbal fabrication, directed thought and evaluation. This is how you talk to yourself. You come up with a topic and then you start making comments on it. Mental fabrication is the perceptions you hold in mind, the images you have in mind, or the labels you put on things. You can change those, so you don't have to suffer so much from things. Even the way you breathe, you can change the way you breathe around the pain. Often we're afraid that the pain, if it gets disturbed by our breath, it'll strike back at us. So we breathe in such a way where we feel really constricted around the pain. That makes it worse. Remind yourself the breath got there first. The breath is already there in the body. So allow it to have its space to move through that part of the body. And you'll find that it alleviates a lot of the problem with the pain. So that's dealing with harsh words, dealing with pain, dealing with the fact that someone has died. One of my favorite stories from the commentary is of a king whose queen dies, and he's very upset. He doesn't admit that she's dead. She's just kind of resting. You know, like the parrot in the Monty Python skit. And so he keeps the body there. And the people in the palace, of course, don't like this. I mean, his corpse hanging around the palace. And so they find this monk who's psychic. And they say, can you get in touch with where she is right now? And he searches her out, and she finds that she's a worm. And so he gets the worm, brings her into the palace, and gets so that the worm can speak. And asks the worm, do you miss the king? No, I don't miss the king. I've got this other guy he's a really nice worm. He's a really good hunk. And so the king says, okay, enough, she's gone. So that's something else you learn how to accept. But then in accepting, you have to remind yourself, okay, this happens to everybody. There's a case of another king, Basenadi, whose queen dies while he's talking with the Buddha. The word comes to him then. And he just breaks down when he's told this. And the first thing the Buddha says to it is it ever have been the case that someone who's been born doesn't die? This happens to everybody, everywhere. And the thought of that helps to take, if you really let yourself think about it for a while, it takes the sharpness of the pain that why is the universe dumping on me? It's not just dumping on you, it's dumping on everybody. This helps to turn the grief into compassion. You start thinking other people are suffering like this too. You hold that in mind, that makes the grief a lot less. Finally, with accepting the fact that you've harmed people in the past, the Buddha says you have to realize that remorse is not going to take or undo what you've done in the past. If you deny what you've done in the past, you're not going to learn. So you have to admit, okay, that was a mistake I made, I harmed somebody. Resolve not to repeat the mistake. But then he says, develop thoughts of goodwill for yourself, thoughts of goodwill for the person you harmed, thoughts of goodwill for everybody. Goodwill for yourself means that I'm not going to beat myself up over this. Thoughts of goodwill for the person you harmed is I'm not going to resent them. I got a letter for a while back from someone who's translating something I had written into Korean. And he says, you're talking about not resenting people who have harmed you and not resenting people you have harmed. He said, what does he mean resenting people you have harmed? The fact that there's somebody there in the world who knows that you've misbehaved. A lot of people can't stand that. And they'll try their best to destroy that person's reputation, get rid of that person. So there's a way that we sometimes get revenge on people that we've harmed. So you have to have goodwill for them, wish for their happiness. And then finally wish for the happiness of all beings, to remind yourself, I don't want to harm anybody ever again. So the Buddha doesn't just, these are the things that you have to accept, but the Buddha doesn't just leave you there suffering from acceptance. Because the kind of acceptance that comes when you're not thinking wisely about something tends to get grudging and defeatist. So okay, I accept these things, but I can learn from them. And I don't have to suffer from them in the meantime. As for things not to accept, of course, there's the fact that you've got unskillful qualities in the mind. This is not where you practice contentment. My concentration is miserable, I'll just learn how to accept that, and that'll be wise. It's not wise. Concentration is something you want to develop. And you don't develop it by accepting the fact that it's not good. You say, I've got to do something about this. Remember what the Buddha said, the secret to his awakening was one, earnest effort, and then two, not resting content with his skillfulness. Listen to that. Even his skillful qualities, he wouldn't be content with them, as long as he hadn't reached full awakening. I mean, you look at his story. He tried again and again and again, one false path after another. He didn't give up. I mean, there was a very strong desire that he wanted to find the end of suffering. And he said, okay, if it's possible through human effort, I'm going to find it. So this is one of those cases where desire is a good thing. We're told that one of the types of suffering the Buddha talks about actually is not getting what you want. And sometimes people interpret that saying, well, if I just don't want anything, then I'll be okay. But that's not what the Buddha's talking about. When he says not getting what you want, specifically it means being subject to aging, not wanting to grow, not wanting to age. Being subject to illness, not wanting to get ill. Being subject to death, not wanting to die. And he says that these things are not to be gained by wanting alone. You can't just want your way out of them. But he's not saying don't want those things. He's basically saying find out, okay, how do I actually attain that? How do I understand cause and effect in such a way that I can actually create the actions that would lead to the end of aging, illness, and death? So rather than just sitting there and saying, okay, I'll accept the fact that this is the way the world is, he was determined, I've got to find the way out of this. And it has to do with understanding cause and effect, how the mind creates its experience, and then figuring out how can I use that knowledge in such a way that I can get past aging, illness, and death. This is why when the Buddha talked about his awakening, in the shortest terms, it was a principle of causality, which comes down basically that there are two kinds of causes. One, you do something right now and the results come right now. You stop doing it and the results stop. In other words, they arise at the same time, pass away at the same time. You stick your finger into a fire, you don't have to wait until your next lifetime to get the results. It burns right now. You take it out, it stops burning. However, there will be a scar. That scar will take a little while to wear off. That's the second kind of causality, which is you do something now, and it's going to have an influence that goes for a while, even when the original impulse is stopped. But eventually that will end. And we live life in basically dealing with these two types of causality, which means that at any moment, right now, you're experiencing the results of some of your past actions. You're experiencing your intentions in the present moment, and you're also experiencing some of the results of your intentions in the present moment. And the way the Buddha analyzes this, he says basically you've got influences coming in from the past, from your past karma. And the way you shape them with your present intentions is how you actually experience the present moment. Without your present intentions, there would be no experience of the present moment. So you have to look at what am I doing right now, and it turns into those same types of fabrication that I talked about earlier. Bodily fabrication, the way you breathe; verbal fabrication, the way you talk to yourself; mental fabrication, the perceptions you hold in mind, and the feelings you focus on. And so when an emotion comes up into the mind, and you realize, okay, this is an unskillful emotion, you don't just sit with it. You ask yourself, how am I breathing around this? Say you're angry. When you're angry, how are you breathing in a way that aggravates the anger? In fact, that's a lot of this feeling we have sometimes. I just got to get this out of my system. Because the breath energy in the body is all screwed up because of the emotion. Can you breathe calmly through the body to get that feeling out of your body? And then you can look at the mental side. How am I talking to myself about this issue? And then secondly, what are the perceptions I have around this? Say you're angry at your boss. What are you telling yourself about the boss? You say, he always does this, she always does this, whichever. Does the boss always do that? Well, no. But it's bad enough as it is. Okay, how do I talk to myself in a way that I don't have to feel like I'm being oppressed by that, the boss's misbehavior? And then secondly, what are the perceptions you have about the boss? This is where the Buddha's teachings are really good, because he gives us new ways of talking to ourselves, new ways of visualizing things to ourselves. So much of the canon, so much of the teachings are just that. Like the images he has you hold in mind. If someone's been misbehaving toward you and treating you badly, he says you've got to maintain goodwill for that person. Visualize your goodwill as being large like the earth. And the person who's abusing you is really small. And the image he has is someone who comes along with a bucket and a hoe and says, I want this earth to be without earth. And so he digs here and digs there, spits here, spits there, urinates here, urinates there. And it's never going to make the earth be without earth, because the earth is so much bigger. And if you can perceive your goodwill as being big like the earth, and your boss being like that little man who's spitting here and spitting there, it's a lot easier to deal with this situation. Now, this doesn't mean you just have to put up with the boss's misbehavior, but if you're not feeding your anger about the boss by the way you perceive the situation, by the way you talk to yourself, or by the way you breathe, you can come up with better ways of dealing with the situation. A while back, I was giving a Zoom meeting with a group of people who worked at Apple, and one of the middle-level management guys was talking about how he had a problem with anger. And he says, the people who work under me just really hate it when I come down hard on them. I'm trying to make them do a better job, and I get really get on their case, and they really resist what I have to say. And he says, I suppose you're going to tell them, no, don't be so hard on them. I said, no, I have an Apple phone. I want my Apple phone to work. I want them to do a good job. But you've got to be wiser about how you try to get them to do a good job. Yelling at them is not the way. How can you inspire them to want to do a good product? And what shocked me was that idea had never occurred to him. So, but if you can pull out of the situation, as I said, through the way you talk to yourself, through the way you visualize things to yourself, you can come up with a better situation, a better way of resolving the situation than if you're eaten up by anger about the situation. The same analysis applies to lust, it applies to fear, it applies to jealousy. You've got to stop and ask yourself, how am I breathing? How am I talking to myself? What are the images I'm holding in mind? What are the feelings that are coming up in my body and my mind? How can I change the way I fabricate the present moment? Because it's, as I said, you've got these potentials coming in from the past, which is your past karma. But you've got your present intentions, these three types of fabrication. It's like going into the kitchen and finding that there was lousy food in the kitchen. Now, if you're a bad cook, the food is going to come out bad. If you're a good cook, you can take garbage and you can turn it into something edible. Another story about Ajahn King. Before he ordained, first he was a chef for the Restaurant de France not in Paris, in Singapore. Learned to be a really good cook, but it was a high-pressure environment. He got out of there. And when he finally decided to ordain, he decided, well, let's find a lower-pressure environment so I can make some money, give it to my parents before I ordain. So he worked for the British Club. As we all know, the word British cuisine is an oxymoron, you know? But one day they had this fixed price meal, and they had a cream of asparagus soup. And more people came than they expected, and they ran out of soup. And so at that point, Kang was his name. He said, okay, everybody out of the kitchen. And he went into the garbage and got all the asparagus scrapings out of the garbage. Chopped them up nicely, made a nice bechamel sauce, and made a really good asparagus soup out of the garbage. Now this is what the Buddha is telling you to do with your life. Because when he teaches you not to suffer, he's not saying, I'm offering the path to the end of suffering only to people who don't deserve to suffer. He's saying, look, whatever you've done in the past, there's a way you don't have to suffer from it. So you think of yourself in the present moment, okay, bad things come in, how can I deal with this in such a way that I'm not suffering from it, and I'm not causing suffering to anybody else? Now you notice this means that you have choices in the present moment. You do have freedom of choice. And you do play a role as an agent. This is something that's really misunderstood. Sometimes we're told, well, the Buddha teaches there is no self, therefore you can't do anything, you just have to accept what's coming up. And that's like tying your hands behind your back. Because the Buddha never said there was no self. When he says not self, he's basically talking about an activity. The way we have our sense of self is an activity, it's a strategy. It's also a value judgment. Our sense of not self is also a strategy and a value judgment. And he's basically saying, learn how to use these things wisely before you put them down. Because eventually, perceptions of self, perceptions of no self will have to go, along with all other perceptions, along with all the other aggregates. But in the meantime, you learn how to use them. And the Buddha talks about using a sense of self in basically three ways. One is, in the path, you have a sense of yourself as being competent to do the path. You can take responsibility for doing the path. You can do it. One of his reflections is, this is one with Venerable Ananda. He says basically, the sense of I am is a kind of conceit. He says, but we're trying to overcome conceit, but in the meantime, we have to use conceit wisely in order to overcome conceit. So when you hear that other people gained awakening, you tell yourself, okay, they're human beings, they can do it. I'm a human being, why can't I? You've got to have that attitude. So that's the self as being competent and responsible. The self as being the part of you who's going to enjoy the results of this practice. This the Buddha calls the self as a governing principle. Excuse me. If you're getting discouraged in the path, he says, you remind yourself, I got onto this path because I loved myself. I wanted to stop suffering. Do I no longer want to stop suffering? And realize, okay, I do want to get to the end of suffering, so I've got to stick with the path. So that's the you who's going to benefit from the practice. And the Buddha even says to the monks, whatever is not yours, let go of it. That will be for your long-term welfare and happiness. So he has that sense of self there, that you will benefit from this. He uses that as part of your motivation. And then finally, there's the self who's, I guess you might call the metacognition self, which is steps back and looks at what you're doing and says, okay, this is working, this is not working. And you want to train that self to be pretty demanding, but at the same time understanding. The inner critic. Some people say, we've got to get rid of the inner critic, it's the bad person. If you had no inner critic, I would not trust you. We all have to be able to say, I step back from my actions, I can see where they're causing harm, and I've got to change my ways. The way the Buddha teaches this, and it's interesting that it's one of the first lessons he gives to his own son. Before you do anything, ask yourself, what do I expect to be the result of this action that I want to do? Notice that, the I. You use the concept of I. You are an agent. You take responsibility for your actions. And if you expect that there's going to be any harm, you don't do it. You act only on the actions that you think will cause no harm. Because if you know that's going to cause harm and you go ahead and do it anyhow, you're not learning anything. But you want to learn from, okay, these are the intentions I think will be harmless, let's act on them. While you're doing it, you look at the results that are coming up. And again, this action that I am doing, what are the results? If you see that there's harm, you stop. If you don't see any harm, you can continue. When the action is done, you're still not done. You look at this action that I did, what were the long-term consequences? And if you see that there was harm that was caused that you didn't expect, okay, you've learned something. And then you resolve not to repeat the mistake, and then you go talk it over with someone else who's more advanced on the path. So you get some ideas about how not to repeat that mistake again. If there was no harm, you take joy in the fact that, okay, your training is progressing, and you continue training yourself in this way. Now notice, it's always I. There's a strong sense of self there, being responsible. You are the agent. Why people would want to deny their agency, I have no idea, aside from the fact that maybe afraid of being held responsible for something and they being criticized for mistakes. But that's a childish attitude. Years back, there was a German psychologist who was studying infant behavior. And he noticed that there was something about little baby children that made them happiest was the fact when they found that they could do something repeatedly and get the same result. Like, mah, 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 mah. And this is why children drive you crazy, because they found that they can do something and they'll just repeat it without stopping. But for them, it's a source of joy. They're figuring out cause and effect. They're figuring out, I can make a difference in my experience. And I figured something out. So there's a joy in agency. And when you're practicing the Buddha's teachings, basically we're trying to take that same joy in agency and use it for something better than just making a noise again and again. We're doing it to put an end to suffering. which means that we take on the attitude, okay, there is going to be a sense of self doing this, and you have a sense of the world in which you're acting. Now those are things that, when you put them together, the Buddha said, that's a state of becoming. Now we know that becoming is bhava in Pali. Any craving that leads to becoming is going to lead to suffering. But the Buddha also saw that if you crave no becoming, in other words, you try to go in for total obliteration, total blanking out, that doesn't solve the problem. The way you solve the problem is to learn how to do states of becoming with knowledge. Like these three kinds of fabrication I was talking about. These are the things that lead eventually to a state of becoming. You try to do them with knowledge, and these become part of the path. So you create, like when you're getting the mind into concentration, there's you who's doing the concentration, there's a sense of the body in which you are experiencing the concentration, and you're maintaining it. Okay, there's a sense of becoming going on right there. And becoming is basically based on the four kinds of clinging. Desire for pleasure, views about the world, our attachment to habits and practices, and our sense of ourself. And the Buddha is basically saying, okay, learn how to do those things skillfully. You know, ordinarily, our desire for pleasure comes down to a desire for sensual pleasure. And he says, it's not that the sensual pleasures themselves are so bad, but his definition of sensuality is our fascination with thinking about sensual pleasures we want. And this can drive us to do all kinds of things. Like right now, you say, after this talk, after this monk stops talking and the people start asking questions, I can go out and get a pizza. And you can sit here thinking about, do I want pepperoni or not? Do I want a vegetarian pizza? Or do I want to be, whatever? And you can think about this for the entire time of the talk. In fact, someone did a study one time of talks given in the corporate world and found that people pay attention only usually the first 10 minutes of the talk, and then they fantasize about sex, fantasize about other things for the whole rest of the talk. That's clinging to sensuality. Okay, the Buddha says, okay, we don't use that on the path, but we do provide an alternative pleasure, which is the pleasure of getting the mind into concentration. And he talks about getting a sense of ease, a sense of rapture, and then letting it fill the whole body. And that's your nourishment on the path. As for the view of the world, okay, the Four Noble Truths provide you with a view of the world. You know, that the most important issue in the world is putting an end to suffering. And it's going to require that you be harmless in the world. That goes into habits and practices. I want to develop the habits of a harmless person. I want to develop practices of training the mind. So I can focus it on the thing that I'm desiring, which is the end of suffering. And finally, there's a sense of you, the me in that world, that can do this. Now, ordinarily, when we create a state of becoming, say you want to be a state of becoming around pizza. Okay, the world there is everything that is relevant to your getting or not getting the pizza. Other things in the world right now would be irrelevant to that particular state of becoming. As for you, your political views have no bearing right now on that state of becoming. It's just you, and as the person who can get the pizza, you are the person who will enjoy the pizza. And then the question is, okay, how do I go about this? What are the ways of getting this? There's a sense of how to behave within that world to get the pizza that I want. Now, this is kind of a way in which we approach all of our desires. When I give a talk in America, I say this is basically being like a beaver. Do you know what a beaver is? It's this animal that builds dams. And they've discovered that you take a baby beaver who has lost its parents, didn't get taught by its parents how to make a dam, but you get them big enough and you release them into the forest, they will make dams. The only thing I think of in Australia would be a lyrebird. A lyrebird creates that little bower to attract the female. And nobody tells it how to do that. It just does it instinctively. Human beings and all beings actually instinctively create states of becoming. You approach a desire, the question is, where in the world, what world does that desired object exist in? What kind of identity can I take on so I can get that thing? And then there will be an idea about the world, how you behave within that world, who you are within that world, the pleasure you're going to get. You've got clinging, which leads to becoming. Now the Buddha is basically telling you, okay, take that habit you have and create a you who will practice all the way to the end of suffering. Now the difference is going to be that when you take on this type of becoming, you actually see the process of becoming clearly. You get the mind into concentration, you can begin to see these activities of the mind much more clearly than you could without the concentration. And this is his strategy for getting you beyond becoming. You see, oh, this is how it comes together. You put this state of becoming together in such a way that you find that other states of becoming are no longer so appealing. And they become irrelevant to what you want for this goal of putting out of suffering. And then finally, that's the last attachment you have. And they begin to see, well, this too has its drawbacks. As I said earlier, your sense of self is a value judgment, that something is worth holding on to. You finally get to the point where you realize, okay, even this has its drawbacks. I don't want to hold on to this anymore. But it's taken to a place where you don't want to go back to your old ways. In which you take this apart, then you're totally free. So you're taking use of that, you're making use of that habit you have, and you're putting it to good purpose. So in cases like this, to back up a little bit, we're talking about this kind of becoming you have. It's based around anger, based around jealousy, based around lust, based around fear. You can learn how to take these things apart by basing yourself on the experience you gain getting the mind into concentration, and begin to see, this is how I put these mental states together. When you're in concentration, you're very sensitive to how you're breathing, you're very sensitive to how you're talking to yourself. You get very sensitive to the images you hold in mind. And once you get more sensitive to these things, then you can apply that knowledge to all your other unskillful becomings as you create this really skillful one. So in this case, adopting a sense of self as being responsible, as being competent to do this, someone who's going to benefit from the practice, and someone who has the ability to gauge what's working and what's not working, so you can direct yourself so that the skill becomes your skill. This is an important part of the practice. When that sense of self, those senses of self have served the purpose, then you let them go. So when the Buddha is talking about acceptance, you have a very clear idea, okay, what is you accept and what things you don't accept. And the things that you do have to accept, how do you learn not to suffer from them? And that way you get a more complete picture of what the Buddha is talking about when he talks about acceptance and non-acceptance. Now, I've thrown a lot of things at you. So, if you find any pieces on the floor, pick them up and ask me about them. How do you handle questions here?
So we have questions. We'll pass the mic around so that everyone can hear. Do we have? Yes.
Ajahn, you touched on not self in that speech, and talked about becoming and being this competent self. The sort of looking through online platforms, there are so many different versions of definitions of that not self, or anicca dukkha anatta. Could you please clarify that, especially the not self part?
The not self about?
So in Buddhist teaching, the not self, what does that mean?
Okay, basically it's a value judgment, that this is not worth holding on to. When the Buddha talks about how the five aggregates are not self, he starts out by saying they're inconstant, they're stressful. And from that, he doesn't come to the conclusion that there is no self. He basically says, are they worth holding on to? And for an arahant, they're all not worth holding on to, or someone who's on the verge of being an arahant. But those of us who are not quite there yet, we're not ready for that blanket perception. So you say, well, where am I on the path right now? Am I in the stage where I have to create myself as my own mainstay? Because remember the Buddha talks about attahiyata no nato. The self is its own mainstay. The self is, the self as a governing principle. You use these as part of the path, as long as they're useful perceptions. And again, it's going to be a value judgment. The best analogy I can think of is probably the famous one of the raft. When you build you're on this side of the river, it's dangerous, you want to get to the other side of the river where it's safe. There's no Nibbana yacht that's going to come over and pick you up and take you back. You've got to create a raft. Now, where do you create the raft out of? The twigs and leaves and branches on this side of the river, i.e. the aggregates. And then you put that raft in the river, and do you let it go? No, you hold on. And you make an effort with your hands and your feet, and you get to the other side. Once you've got to the other side, you say, okay, now I don't need this anymore. And that's when even the raft becomes not self. I mean, it's the perception of not self is not that mysterious a thing. We're doing it all the time. It's just that we're vaguely aware of it. But think about, suppose you had a little sister, and somebody down the street is beating her up. She's your sister. You go down and you defend her. You bring her back home. She starts playing with your toy truck and won't give it back to you. All of a sudden, she's the other, Now, at that point, she is not self, So that these boundary lines between self and not self, and the whole notion of self requires a boundary line. Which part is me, which part is not me? And so certain things are kind of not self. We don't consciously think of not self, but it's the things that are not me out there. And the question is, how wise are we in drawing those boundary lines? Now, eventually, as you practice, the boundary lines, the sense of self gets smaller and smaller and smaller, because there are fewer and fewer things that are worth holding on to. And to finally decide, okay, I've got to let go of everything. But then we let go of everything, you have to also let go of the perception of not self. Both perceptions of self and not self, they're aggregates. So you let them go. In the meantime, you can think of your sense of self as being like an amoeba that takes different shapes. I made this comparison one time in French, when I was teaching in France. And I was making the comment that, okay, sometimes your sense of self is like a human being, sometimes it's like an animal, sometimes it's kind of like this shapeless blob. And the person who's translating me into French got stuck. Until a woman out in the audience said, there is no French word for blob. So again, you think of self as an activity that you do. I am applying this perception to these things. But not self is also perception that you apply to things. And the question is, when and where do you apply these things wisely? Because not self can be applied unwisely as well. There was one of Ajahn Chah's monks, a Thai student of Ajahn Chah, was driving along one time with one of his students, and he noticed that the pickup truck they were driving was really dirty. And he made a comment to the driver, saying, "You really ought to clean your truck." And the driver said, "Oh, it's impermanent. If I clean it, it's going to get dirty again. I'm just letting it be not self." That's the unskillful use of not self. Does that answer your question?
Thank you, Bhante.
Any further questions?
Well,
Thank you. Thinking a bit about the difference between non-harm and passivity.
mm-hmm.
Sometimes when you're in the corporate world, people identify that you're a Buddhist, and there can always be that willingness to try to step on you because you know that you are not inclined to harm them.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any thoughts on how to handle that in the corporate world?
Well, two things. It's interesting when the Buddha talks about harming other people, he only mentions two things. One is getting them to break the precepts, and two is getting them to give rise to greed, aversion, and delusion. Interesting, no? He says you harm yourself by breaking the precepts around those people. But the way you harm them is getting them to break the precepts, because then it becomes their karma. Now, the other point that comes to my mind is my teacher had a student who was a seamstress, and people found out that she was a Buddhist. And they said, why are you charging so much for your clothing? You should, as a Buddhist, you should be nice and frugal and not greedy. And as she told my teacher, she said, I know my prices are fair. What do I say to these people? And my teacher's response was that tell them you're not becoming a Buddhist to become stupid. So, and if you lived with any of the Thai Ajahns, they have pretty sharp tongues. And they will say sharp things with a compassionate motive. And also know that monks are allowed to strike back in self-defense. We can't kill. But you get the idea, right? You don't want the fact that you're a Buddhist to become, again, to tie your hands. There was a question here.
Thank you, Ajahn. I've got a question, it's a bit technical. There was quite a lot that you spoke about self and non-self, and I understand a bit about the non-self as perception that's being on non-self, but I was curious whether in the canon, the Buddha spoke more about what is the self, the permanent self. Is it the puru?
Didn't talk about that at all. He talked about many different ways of defining self. There are permanent selves, impermanent selves, finite selves, infinite selves. He rejected them all. He said these are not a wise way of defining yourself. He said however you define yourself, you limit yourself. So whatever concept you have of self, the question is it going to be useful for what I need for the purpose of the path? And it's good to think about, we talk about different states of becoming. You have many becomings that you've used in the past. And they're still on call. In other words, you can pick them up at any time and use them again. And sometimes without your choosing them, they will come in and say, hey, do it this way, hey, do it that way, go for this, go for that. These are all desires and identities you've had in the past. And so each of us has our own stable of identities, which you're going to have to learn to sort out in the course of the practice. And so you say, okay, I can take this on temporarily if it seems wise. If it doesn't seem wise, I have to learn either to argue with it or just kind of put it out to pasture. But the Buddha would never have you define who you are. And what I found really interesting, this is one of the nice things about having the Pali Canon on a CD-ROM, is you can check, what words actually appear in the canon, which words do not appear in the canon. And the words 3 characteristics do not appear. He talks about, inconstancy, stress, not self. He talks them about as perceptions, as contemplations, but he doesn't identify them as characteristics. So again, it's a question of how do I use this perception in a wise way? How do I contemplate the fact that, okay, there are certain things that are about me that are not under my control, that I've been trying to control but I can't. Other things that I can't totally control but I can control partially. How do I make a good partial use out of these things? Like the 5 aggregates. Eventually you're going to realize you have to let them go. But what is your state of concentration made out of? Form, the breath, the feeling of pleasure, the perception of staying with the breath in the body, the thought constructs, with the intentions that keep you there and the way you talk to yourself, and your consciousness of the state of concentration. Those are all aggregates. So even though you eventually have to let them go, in the meantime you use them. And the question is, who are you using them? Is it, don't bother, You'll take that apart eventually at some point, but learn how to use them first. Does that answer your question?
More questions?
Thank you for being here, Ajahn. I have a question on grief. You were talking about grieving and giving the example of the king and so on. My question is around supporting someone who's in the process of grieving.
Mm-hmm.
And I think quoting a scripture or something can be seen by that person as glib or insensitive or something. It's like what you're just quoting. And so I'm just wondering if you can expand a little bit more on grief and skillful uses.
Okay, well, the Buddha talks about what we may call good symptom management for grief, which is one, you do reflect on the fact that you're not the only one who's lost somebody. Two, you do give expression to your grief. There are way too many Buddhists who say, gee, I shouldn't be feeling grief, so I shouldn't express my grief. Go ahead. And figure out, okay, what are some good ways of expressing how much that person meant to me? And this is why we have eulogies, this is why we have ceremonies where we make merit for people, to show that, okay, that person really did mean a lot to me. But at the same time, you have to have a sense, that that relationship is not the defining relationship of my life. I do have other responsibilities, I have other needs, I have other desires. It's right eventually to say, okay, enough of that, I have to move on. So you're talking to someone, trying to be sensitive, okay, where are they in that process? Are they ready to move on? Sometimes they're not quite ready to move on, so you say, okay, well, what more do you want to say? What more do you want to express about your loss? What's interesting from the Buddhist point of view is that grief has awful lot to do with our sense of me, my loss. I have been, part of me was defined by that relationship, and now it's been ripped away. And as usual, when you talk about Buddhist teachings to somebody, especially someone who's, when you're not a monk, it's harder. Even when you're a monk, it can be hard. My father always gave permission for me to become a monk, but he wasn't happy about it. And see, there was a time later on when he was going through a severe depression. I went back home to visit him. I knew I was not going to mention the B word at all. But I was taking Buddhist teachings and not presenting them as, a doctrine or a scripture or something like that, but just common sense. And it got him out of his depression. So trying to speak common sense to the person who's... There's hands up here in the front.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Ajahn, for coming today. I have a question. My sister committed suicide, and I'm curious to know was the act of the suicide itself bad karma for her?
It's considered unskillful, yeah. Because there's a lot of anger. And you think if you can give that, you allow yourself to be so angry about things that you're willing to kill yourself, that's an awfully strong anger. Now what the immediate results of that are going to be, there's no telling. I mean, karma is very, very complex. So you have to say, okay, maybe she went to a good place afterwards, but there's going to be some bad karma down the line. Or maybe she went to a bad place, in which case I've got to make a lot of merit dedicated to her. But it's unskillful karma, but we all have unskillful karma. Ask anybody in the room, is anybody who has no unskillful karma at all? And if someone is suffering right now more than other people, it's not that, let me back up a little bit. We have this misunderstanding that we all have a karma account. And what we see right now is the running balance. Your bad karma plus your good karma, subtract your bad karma, this is what you got. Karma is a lot more complex than that. The Buddha's image is of a field. You've got lots of different seeds in the field. And certain seeds are sprouting right now, other seeds are not sprouting. Other seeds have sprouted and have died. So what you see right now are just the seeds that are sprouting. Now the potential that that person may have to have other good seeds in the back or other bad seeds in the field. We don't know that. Which is why you don't look down on people who are suffering the results of bad karma right now. And you're not jealous of the people whose karmic seeds are good right now. So in this particular case, she did something that was really unskillful. That would put some more bad seeds in her field. But that doesn't negate the fact that she also had good seeds. Question here.
Thanks, Ajahn. Just having a little trouble keeping up with some of your ideas and information you're giving, so I was wondering if you could please review...
The main points?
Sorry?
The main points?
I got the bit at the beginning and at the end, but the bit in the middle.
I gave a talk one time on the 5 strengths, and someone said, "Could you repeat that talk?" And so I gave another talk on the 5 strengths. It wasn't the same talk, but it was
More specifically, it was the bit where you were talking about when people are at a meeting and then they only focus for 10 minutes and then they're off about pizza or fantasising or whatever. So that if the person is off about thinking about pizza, then your comment was that you can't get the attainment. That's probably not the right word. So
No,
could you please explain that a bit more?
That's
please?
what sensuality is your fascination with thinking about pleasures and planning pleasures. I want it like this. No, I'd like it like that. How about like this? How about like that? I mean, sexual fantasies are a huge example of this. But that's what the Buddha means by sensuality. When he says that you are divorced or secluded from sensuality, he's not saying you're away from sensual pleasures. Because otherwise we'd have to throw all meditators into prison. He's basically saying, but you're just not thinking that kind of thought.
And so that's when you've just got to come back to the breath.
You come back to the breath. Yeah. And so I'm going to find pleasure just in the way I inhabit my body. Because that's called a pleasure of form, which is not a sensual pleasure. And it doesn't have a lot of the disadvantages of sensual pleasures.
Okay. All right.
Or of sensual thinking.
All right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. That's it?
Looks
There's
like...
a hand over here.
See, there's always another question. Okay.
Ajahn, thank you very much for the talk. Was just curious about what you found most helpful to get your father out of depression.
It was basically asking him questions. I don't want to go into the details of his relationship with my stepmother, but she was the classic stepmother, And just asking him questions about his role in that relationship, her role in that relationship, and just questioning. Because a lot of times when people are in depression, all possibilities just seem to close in on them. And by raising some questions, it kind of got him out of that mindset. Hand over here. Okay.
Oh no, I was just clarifying. So it's just opening up the field of possibilities.
Right.
Yeah.
Because that's a lot of what depression is. Your range of possibilities is closed in on you.
Just to continue that train about sensuality. So in another example, say you're going out for pizza, you're not thinking about it, you're thinking about present moment, present moment. You order off the menu, present moment. The pizza arrives, present moment. Pizza in the mouth, bites down. Ah, what a great sensation, pleasant sensation, you know. And then, you know, you finish the meal, you never think about it again. Can you talk about the advantages and disadvantages of that experience versus the fantasy and, you know, fantasizing it about that experience, and I guess the role they both play in the progression on the path?
Okay, the Buddha gives an interesting analogy at one point where he says you're exercising sense restraint, which basically you're watching over your reaction to what you're experiencing right now, and where your mind tends to elaborate, where it tends to run off, and you're trying to keep it under control. He says if you just try to keep it under control, it's not going to work. You've got to have an alternative pleasure. So say you're coming out of a nice meditation and you still have that sense of energy and you still have the sense of rapture and fullness and pleasure, and you go down to the pizza joint and you say, oh, I'll have a pizza, but I really want to stay with this sense of pleasure that I've got inside my body. That's how you do it. Otherwise, you're just putting a clamp on top of your desire for pleasure and not providing any alternative. The mind's going to rebel. It's going to go back home and say, wait a minute, I could have enjoyed that pizza much more if I'd elaborated on it beforehand and afterwards. So you've got to provide an alternative pleasure.
Thank you.
And if there are no more questions, well, I won't do it.
Ajahn, just about like sensuality when you're in meditation, say your mind wanders off. I read in the introduction to The Handful of Leaves, an extract from a sutta where it talks about the perception of unattractiveness. And the way I interpreted it was to think of whatever the benefits of the meditation are, and to think of the loss of those benefits if I was to follow this train of thought. Would that count as the perception of unattractiveness?
Well, basically, it's one of the ways of turning off that particular line of thought. See, if I follow this line of thought, where is it going to take me? It's going to take me to do things I'm going to regret at some point down the line. But it's also useful to have practice in the contemplation of the unattractiveness of the body, to sort of reinforce that.
I see. And in terms of perceptions, is it always the case that your perception is what you have to use to draw the mind here and there?
It's either the perception or it's going to be the way you talk to yourself. Now, a lot of the ways you talk to yourself are based on perceptions. But sometimes the way you talk to yourself will give a meaning to a perception that it wouldn't have had otherwise. So they influence each other.
Thank you, Ajahn.
Way in the back.
Way in the back. Okay.
Thank you, Ajahn, for your guided meditation, your Dhamma talk. In a situation where someone comes to us to let us know that perhaps some actions and words we've said and done that they're not happy about, and they try to communicate to us so that we can consider their feelings more and perhaps do things more according to their liking. So usually, I try to
see where this is going.
listen and try to, hear them out, try to understand their feeling, and then try to show empathy and see if I can consider their feelings more. But at the same time, just wondering what would be a wise yet compassionate way that can actually also help the person to see, it can just be unpleasant sound, to help them see more clearly, and rather than indulging in expecting people to behave that way, but without coming across as not empathetic.
You have to get them at a moment where they're not spilling out all their hurt feelings. Wait a little while. And then let them know, the Buddha didn't say that we have to go around making sure we don't hurt anybody's feelings. I mean, the Buddha himself hurt quite a few people's feelings. When he said Devadatta is going to go to hell, Devadatta didn't like that. Can you imagine it? Can you imagine the Devadatta comes, could you please more be empathetic about my feelings? I'm going to have to think that one over. That's a question that keeps coming up, and I've got to get a better answer. There's a hand here.
Do we have another question? Yes.
There's a question over here, and one over there.
There are an overwhelming number of voices in the Buddhist world that contradict one another. Sometimes they're only seeming contradictions, and they're just in different contexts. But other times,
there really are contradictions.
There are genuine contradictions. And as a beginner who is drowning in delusion, how can I have a refuge in myself when I don't know who to trust, when I don't know whose interpretation of this sutta is right, whose method of practice is right, etc.?
The Buddha said what he looked for in a student was that they be honest and observant. And so you're going to have to depend on your own honesty and your own powers of observation. And so I'd say, take something where you think the teacher is being honest, the teacher is being trustworthy, and give it a try, what the teacher is saying. And then if the results are not really good, you can talk it over with the teacher. And if you get to the point where you don't feel satisfied with the teacher's answers, that's why I said look for somebody else. Because we live in this world. The Buddha said there'd be a period when there was no counterfeit Dharma at all. It was just the genuine thing. And then when counterfeit Dharma appears, he said the true Dharma disappears. Interesting. It's not that there is no true Dharma at all, but the sense that we know for sure 100% this is what the true Dharma is. That's gone. So we live in that world now, where there's no 100% assurance, okay, this is actually what the Buddha taught, and this is what he meant by that. That throws us more and more back on our own honesty. If I put this teaching into practice, what kind of results do I get? And that's kind of the Dharma method, you might say. There's the scientific method for finding things about, scientific issues. This is the Dharma method. When I put this teaching into practice, does it make me more content? Does it make me does it give rouse to more energy into my practice? Or does it turn me into a lazier person? There's a lot of lazy Dharma out there. That would be the first thing I'd look for. The Buddha never said that you can relax to the max all the way to Nibbana. All of his images are warriors, people searching, people trying to develop skills. So take that as your mental image.
There was a question down here somewhere.
Thank you, Ajahn. Isn't the only pleasure found in sensuality merely the relief of the pain it puts on you?
Well, that's basically why we go for sensuality, is just to escape from pain.
So, in terms of like the leper simile, you need a pain first for any notion of scratching to be pleasant.
Right.
So, is the pleasure that we should be going for a different pleasure? Or is it merely just the lack of sensuality which is truly pleasant?
Well, there is a positive pleasure that comes from the way you breathe, the way you get into concert, the way you inhabit your sense of the body. Now, as you get more and more, I'd say more refined in your sensitivities, you begin to realize, well, even the pleasure of concentration gets kind of gross. You want something calmer than that. Then there's the pleasure of equanimity. That gets, that becomes even that becomes burdensome because you've got to maintain it.
Right, so we don't want to have to do anything at all on
Yep.
account of achieving what we are aiming for, right?
Yeah, but in order to get there, you don't do that by not doing anything at all. You get to the point where not doing anything at all leaves you open to only one possibility, which would be the unfabricated.
Thank you.
This question here. You know.
John, when I practice meditation, my mind gets much brighter. When I interact with some people like toxic, like my husband, so my mind go like the bottom and like depressed and low energy, Ajahn. So how do I keep the brightness like always like, yeah.
Okay, well, one thing you've got to learn how to maintain your sense of your sensitivity to the breath energies. And think of that as kind of being like a magnetic field. That as long as you maintain your full body awareness and the breath feels good, it's like other energies can't enter. And then you have lots of goodwill for your husband.
Sorry, Ajahn, I didn't hear. So I didn't hear that.
Have lots of goodwill for your husband. So you're basically radiating good energy. When you radiate good energy, bad energy can't come in.
So Rajan, when it's like verbal abuse, like what we'll do, like I can't keep my sila or morality. Him, like I try to do like this is his the way he is, like what Guru Ajahn said. Like I just try to think about him, but sometimes I lose my precepts, like the 4th precepts. Like I will retaliate him like verbal abuse. So.
Okay, well, you've really got to maintain your precepts. You say, whatever he does, I'm not going to break those precepts.
Yes, Ajahn.
But maintaining the precepts also means that you have to learn how to be intelligent in how you maintain them. In other words, how do I avoid telling lies, but also not tell certain truths that, you know, there are sometimes people will want information out of you and you know they're going to abuse that information. You've got to learn how to avoid the topic. You can't lie. So that raises the bar.
And I find in him, like this marriage, I think it's like really like a hindrance to my practice. Like I see the benefit of the meditation practice, like mine is so bright when I practice and listen to Guru Ajahn teaching, and I really do understand the Four Noble Truths, but yes, the relationship just putting me down. It's like I go to the brightness, then I go to the darkness. Like that's why I go up and bright, then next time it's like bottom, low energy. I don't know how to.
Well, it's like going into battle. So I've got to maintain my practice even while he's being dark. And that way you develop your endurance, you develop your determination, you develop your truthfulness. It's okay. I've got these challenging situations right here. But again, it's like I've got some bad karma from the past that I've got to learn how to deal with and learn how to be a good cook so I don't create bad food here for myself in the present moment. So it's going to be a challenge. But it's a good fight. Way in the back again. Then one more question, way in the back.
Ajahn, I heard you went to visit the National Gallery of Victoria. Well, first of all, I hope you enjoyed it with the other Ajahns, and I'm curious how you connect with art and creative work these days.
It's a weakness. I know, it's part of it has to do with, I mean, I've always been fascinated by the idea of skill. And seeing something that's done really skillfully, I enjoy trying to figure out what was the skill that went into this. Because the National Gallery of Victoria has a painting that I've wanted to see for many years. It's called October by Bastien Lepage. And he was a very skillful painter. And so I enjoyed looking at, okay, what is he trying to accomplish with this? How does he try to accomplish it? And I find seeing other people's skill like that is inspiring. But it's still a weakness. Okay. Well, thank you for your attention.
Okay, so it's all beginnings to become an ending. So well, I think we've come to the end. So just falls to me to thank you, Ajahn, for your time, your energy, and your insights. As always, it's wonderful to hear Dhamma and to have the opportunity to participate in it. So on behalf of everyone, please allow me to thank you.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
And we just conclude however you would wish to. Different Ajahns do differently in terms of the kind of concluding practice, however you would wish.
I was just going to get up and bow down and go.
That sounds fun. Wish you then a safe journey back both to where you're staying tonight and obviously for the rest of the time in Australia and onward after that.
Thank you. Okay.
감사합니다.